Somewhere in the arid belt of northeastern Africa, farmers still cultivate a grain that was feeding human beings 4,000 years before wheat bread rose in Egyptian ovens. This grain requires less than half the water. It survives droughts that destroy everything around it. It stores for years without refrigeration, provides fiber and protein comparable to the world's most celebrated cereals, and asks almost nothing of the soil. And yet, in most Western nations, it is known only as animal feed, or not known at all. There is a grain that does what wheat cannot. In regions where rainfall drops below 15 inches a year, wheat fails. Corn fails. Rice never had a chance. But this grain survives. It endures. In tests conducted during extreme drought conditions across sub-Saharan Africa, this grain continued producing viable seed when neighboring cereal plots had long since gone to dust. More fiber than refined bread, a lower glycemic response than wheat flour, a protein content that rivals or exceeds barley, and none of it requires gluten. For most of the past century, nutritional science in the West paid little attention. The grain was considered primitive, regional, useful only where nothing else would grow. But that framing missed the point entirely. This wasn't a crop of last resort. It was a crop that came first. The earliest evidence of this grain's cultivation comes from the floodplains of what is now Sudan and Ethiopia. Archaeological residues suggest intentional planting as far back as 8,000 years, possibly longer. By the time Egyptian scribes were recording wheat harvests along the Nile, this grain had already sustained entire pastoral societies across the drier interior. It did not require the irrigation networks that made wheat possible. It did not demand rich alluvial soil. It grew on hillsides and sandy basins, in places no other cereal would tolerate. From Africa, it traveled east. By the second millennium BCE, Indian farmers had integrated it into their dryland rotations. It became a staple of the Deccan Plateau, of regions too hot and too seasonal for rice. From India, it continued to China, carried along trade routes that would later be called the Silk Road. Chinese agricultural records from the 3rd century describe it as a reliable summer crop in the arid north. This was not a marginal food. It was a civilizational anchor, a drought-proof reserve for 3 continents. In Ethiopia, it formed the base of fermented breads that predate leavened wheat loaves. In West Africa, it was pounded into porridge, brewed into beer, and roasted into dense portable cakes that could sustain travelers across the Sahel. In India, it became flatbread, unleavened, filling, prepared without ovens. It did not rise like wheat bread, but for hundreds of millions of people, it did not need to. The turning point came slowly, and it came from the outside. When European colonial systems expanded across Africa and Asia, they brought with them not only governance and extraction, but agricultural priority. Wheat, already dominant in Europe, was considered superior, more refined, more modern. Colonial food infrastructure, mills, bakeries, supply chains, was designed around wheat and later corn. This grain had no place in that system, not because it couldn't nourish people. It had been doing so for millennia, but because it didn't behave the way industrial grain processing expected. It had no gluten. That meant it would not rise in the European manner. It could not produce the tall, airy loaves that had become synonymous with bread. European bakers saw this as a deficiency, a failure of chemistry. The grain also resisted modern milling. Its outer layer, rich in fiber and antioxidants, was harder to strip cleanly. The machinery optimized for wheat did not adapt well. What should have been a virtue, a durable, nutrient-dense hull, became a liability. And so the grain was reclassified, not as a staple for humans, as feed for animals. By the mid-20th century, in the United States and much of Europe, this was the only form in which most people encountered it. Livestock feed, silage. Occasionally, syrup boiled from the stalks in the American South, a remnant practice from an earlier era, slowly fading. The crop had not failed. It had been quietly written out of the story. And in its place stood wheat. More demanding, more water-hungry, more vulnerable, but suited to the machines and markets that now controlled the global food supply. In the past 3 decades, the picture has shifted again. Food scientists have returned to this grain, not as a curiosity, but as a serious subject of nutritional and agricultural analysis. What they have found confirms what African and Indian farmers knew for generations. The grain is high in dietary fiber, significantly higher than refined wheat flour. It contains a moderate protein content, comparable to other major cereals, with a balanced amino acid profile. It offers meaningful concentrations of iron, magnesium, phosphorus, and several B vitamins. And then there are the antioxidants. Pigmented varieties, particularly those with red or deep purple bran, contain compounds similar to those found in blueberries and red wine. These have drawn the attention of researchers studying inflammation and oxidative stress. No health claims can be made here, but the chemistry is notable. Perhaps most striking, from a metabolic standpoint, is the glycemic behavior. When consumed as a whole grain, this cereal produces a slower, more gradual rise in blood sugar than white bread or many refined grain products. For those managing insulin sensitivity, this is relevant information, not a cure, but a material distinction. And all of this comes from a plant that requires almost nothing. Agronomists studying climate adaptation have returned to this grain with increasing urgency. It needs less than half the water of wheat. Its root system penetrates deeper into the soil, accessing moisture other crops cannot reach. It tolerates poor soils, including sandy and slightly saline conditions that would stress conventional cereals. It can go dormant during dry spells, shutting down growth rather than dying, and resume when the rains return. This trait alone makes it one of the most drought-resilient grains in cultivation. In a world of shifting rainfall patterns and growing water scarcity, this is not a minor advantage. It is, potentially, a foundational one. The grain is called sorghum. It is still here. More than 500 million people depend on it today, across sub-Saharan Africa, across India, in parts of China, in pockets of the Middle East. In these regions, it has never disappeared. It remains a daily staple, ground into flour, cooked as porridge, fermented into beverages, popped like corn over open flame. In Western markets, it is beginning to return. You will find it in gluten-free flour blends, in whole grain pilafs, in specialty bakeries experimenting with ancient cereals. Some farmers in the American South still press it into syrup, a tradition that dates to the 19th century and never quite died. It grows with little fuss. If you have poor soil, it will tolerate it. If your summers are hot, it will not wilt. If your water access is limited, it will likely outperform any other grain you might plant. The plants are tall, often 6 to 12 feet, with dense seed heads that ripen over the course of late summer. There is no hype required here. Sorghum did not fail. It did not become obsolete. It was simply overlooked by systems that could not accommodate its differences. But the grain remains, and for those who choose to look, it is exactly where it always was, rooted in dry soil, waiting for almost nothing, producing food anyway.